My name is Doris Young. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a financial compliance analyst in Seattle. On paper, my life looks very ordinary. Stable job, small apartment with too many houseplants, the kind of person who remembers birthdays without posting about them. Most people describe me the same way. Quiet, dependable, easy. I've heard that word my entire life. Easy daughter, easy sister, easy to overlook. I don't interrupt. I don't argue loudly. I don't demand attention in rooms that weren't built for me. When something hurts, I tend to observe it before reacting. I catalogue details. I remember the temperature of the air, the angle of the light, the exact phrasing people use when they think their words don't matter. That habit, remembering, has shaped my entire life. This story is about my father, and my brother, and a piano. The title sounds dramatic. My dad sold my childhood piano to pay my brother's debt. But this isn't a story about rage, it's not about revenge, and it's not about a screaming match across a dining table. It's about a sentence. He said I didn't need it anymore, and how I remembered every detail. I grew up in a house where love was practical. We weren't expressive, we were efficient. My father believed in solving problems quickly and quietly. My brother, Daniel, was always in motion. Big plans, bigger risks. I was the opposite. Structured, predictable, responsible. The piano was the one thing that felt mine fully. Not expensive in the grand scheme of the world, not rare, but it held thousands of hours of my childhood. It was where I learned discipline, where I practiced through heartbreak, where I stayed up late after everyone slept, pressing the pedals gently so the sound wouldn't wake anyone. When it disappeared, no one warned me, no one consulted me. It was simply gone. And the explanation was so simple it almost sounded reasonable. You don't use it anymore! That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not visibly, just a quiet internal recalibration. Over the next months and then years, I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I didn't beg for apologies. I watched. I learned. I made decisions. This story isn't about getting even. It's about understanding what happens when someone quietly realizes they've been mismeasured their entire life and chooses calmly to stop fitting into that measurement. I'm going to tell you exactly how it unfolded. No exaggeration, no theatrics, just the truth, as I lived it. Before we begin, have you ever had something taken from you that others insisted wasn't a big deal, but you knew it was? In my family, I was the quiet one. Not the troubled one, not the dramatic one, not the ambitious one, just the quiet one. Daniel, my older brother by 3 years, was the story. He had ideas before breakfast and problems by dinner. He started businesses in high school, quit jobs before the ink dried on his contracts. He was charismatic in the way people forgive easily. Teachers called him gifted. My father called him bold. I was called steady. When relatives visited, they asked Daniel about his plans. They asked me about my grades. When Daniel spoke, people leaned in. When I spoke, people nodded politely and moved on. It wasn't cruelty. That's the part that makes it harder to explain. No one yelled at me. No one told me I didn't matter. They just didn't build space around me. I became the daughter who didn't require attention. The one who handled her own college applications. The one who found scholarships without announcing it. The one who read financial aid documents line by line so my parents wouldn't have to. Doris is so easy, my father used to say to neighbors. She's never caused us trouble. At the time, I wore that like a medal. Easy meant low maintenance. Easy meant mature. Easy meant I was helping. But easy also meant adjustable. If dinner needed to be moved because Daniel had a networking event, I understood. If family savings had to be redirected because Daniel had a short-term gap, I understood. If my music lessons needed to pause for a semester because things were tight, I understood. Understanding became my reflex. The piano entered my life when I was 8. It wasn't new. A second-hand upright with faint scratches near the pedals. My father negotiated hard for it. I remember watching from the hallway as 2 men carried it into the living room, the wood catching the afternoon light. For the first time, something in the house felt chosen for me. Daniel tried it for a week. Then he quit. Said it was boring, too repetitive. I stayed. I practiced scales while he pitched ideas on the phone. I memorized classical pieces while he experimented with stock trading apps in college. The rhythm of my fingers became my private language. Music was the only place where no one interrupted me. But even there, I learned to minimize. I practiced softly, closed the lid halfway at night, timed my sessions around Daniel's calls so the background noise wouldn't interfere. If guests came over, I stopped immediately. I told myself I preferred it that way, that I didn't need applause. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had moved out. The piano remained at my parents' house because my apartment was too small, and because deep down, I thought it would always be there, anchored, waiting. When friends described me, they used words like composed. At work, I was reliable. In the family group chat, I was the one who sent reminders. No one ever asked what I wanted, and I never corrected them, because being needed felt close enough to being valued. I didn't realize that in their minds I had become something functional, like a lamp that always worked. Present, useful, replaceable if necessary but rarely examined. I wasn't at risk. I wasn't the investment. I was the backup plan. And backups, by definition, are expected to wait quietly until called upon. At the time, I didn't resent it. I believed this was simply my role. I just didn't know how much that role would cost me. The first time something felt wrong, it didn't look dramatic. It looked reasonable. I was 29. I had been living in Seattle for almost 4 years, building a life that felt steady and self-contained. My visits home had become predictable. Thanksgiving, Lunar New Year, occasional Sunday dinners when work allowed. The piano was still there, slightly more worn. A faint water ring on the top from someone's tea mug. The bench cushion is more flattened than I remembered. But it was there, pressed against the same living room wall, beneath the framed landscape painting my mother loved. That afternoon, Daniel was late, as usual. My father stood in the kitchen, speaking in that low, tight voice he used when something financial had gone sideways. I wasn't meant to hear it. Just temporary, Daniel was saying over speakerphone. I just need to cover this month. The investor pulled out last minute. How much, my father asked. A pause. $42,000. The number sat in the air like humidity. I stayed still in the hallway, not hiding, just unnoticed, my father exhaled. You always say temporary. I know, but this one is different. It always was. When Daniel finally arrived, he looked tired but not panicked. That was his gift. He could wear uncertainty like it was part of the design. At dinner, no one mentioned the call. My mother asked about my job. My father asked if compliance was interesting enough. Daniel talked about expansion strategies and market timing. I listened. After we ate, I drifted into the living room and sat at the piano. I hadn't played in months. My fingers felt stiff on the keys, but muscle memory returned quickly. A simple Chopin prelude, quiet, controlled. The notes filled the room gently. My father stepped in halfway through. Still playing that? He asked. I smiled. Sometimes. He leaned against the doorframe. You don't really Yosi. Don't really use it anymore. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even harsh, just observational. I do, I said softly, when I'm here. He nodded slowly, as if recalculating something invisible. You have your own life now, he continued. Small apartment, busy schedule. It's just sitting here most of the time. I stopped playing. There was something about the way he said, just sitting here. Like an idle asset, like unused capital. I closed the floorboard gently. It's not in the way, I said. No, he replied quickly. I didn't mean that. But he had. Later that night, I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling. I replayed the conversation in my head. Not emotionally, but analytically. The phrasing, the tone, the timing. It wasn't about space. It was about liquidity. The next morning, Daniel was gone before breakfast. My father was on his laptop, numbers reflecting in his glasses. I poured coffee and asked casually, Is everything okay? He didn't look up. Your brother just needs a little bridge. A bridge? That sounds expensive. I said, Dad. He finally glanced at me. You don't need to worry about it. I nodded. That was the first small cut. Not the debt, not the tension. The assumption that I wouldn't need to be consulted. That which was connected to me was flexible, that my silence meant consent. When I left that afternoon, I paused by the piano before closing the front door. I ran my fingers lightly across the wood, feeling the shallow grooves near middle C. I didn't know it yet, but that would be one of the last times I touched it, and something inside me had already started paying attention. Not emotionally, structurally. A month passed. Then 2. No one mentioned the debt again. Family group messages resumed their usual rhythm. My mother sharing recipes, Daniel sending ambitious articles about market rebounds, my father forwarding practical advice about tax brackets. I responded the way I always did. Calm, brief, efficient. If something had shifted, it wasn't visible on the surface, but I noticed small adjustments. My father began referring to the piano as that old thing, lightly, casually. We should tune that old thing, my mother said one afternoon over video call. My father laughed. For what? It's basically furniture now. Furniture. I smiled through the screen. He still has a good tone. I said, he? My father asked. The piano, I replied. He waved it off. Well, it's just sitting there. Just sitting there. I told myself I was being sensitive. Objects are objects, wooden strings. Sentiment doesn't increase resale value. That's what I would have said to a client at work. So I did what I always did when something felt uncomfortable. I rationalized it. Maybe they were right. I didn't play daily anymore. My apartment couldn't fit an upright. It made sense for it to remain at the house. Maybe I was holding on to something symbolic instead of practical. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed lighter. He posted photos of meetings, announced a strategic pivot, talked about momentum returning. No one explained how the bridge had been financed. I didn't ask. That was our family pattern. We avoided direct lines if curved ones would do. The next time I visited home, the living room felt subtly rearranged. The coffee table angled differently. A lamp moved to the other side. The piano was still there, but its bench was tucked in tightly, as if minimizing its footprint. I sat on it anyway. The keys were slightly out of tune. Middle A carried a faint metallic buzz. I played a simple scale. My father walked through, glanced briefly, and said, "You always liked repetition." There was no malice in it, but there was dismissal, repetition. As if discipline was small, as if consistency were unambitious. Daniel used to quit hobbies when they stopped being exciting. I stayed until something was mastered. That difference had defined us since childhood. But mastery doesn't look dramatic. It looks quiet. At dinner that evening, Daniel described a new opportunity, a partnership. Higher upside, he said. Short-term volatility. My father nodded approvingly. That's how growth works, he said. I listened carefully. No one asked about my projects at work this time. When I mentioned I'd helped restructure a compliance framework for a multi-million-dollar portfolio, Daniel smiled lightly. See? That's why you're good at that stuff. You're patient. Patient. He meant safe. I excused myself early that night and returned to the piano. I didn't play immediately. I just sat there, hands resting in my lap. I looked around the room, the painting above it, the narrow crack near the ceiling moulding, the faint indentation in the rug where the pedals had pressed for years. I realized something uncomfortable. The piano wasn't just mine. It was, in my father's mind, an asset parked in shared space. And assets can be reassigned. I could feel the logic forming in him long before it was spoken. She doesn't use it. It's taking up room. We have other priorities. None of those statements would technically be false. That's how normalization works. It's built on truths arranged without empathy. When I left that weekend, I didn't mention the tuning. I didn't ask about finances. I didn't request reassurance. I simply took a longer look than usual. And I began quietly to detach. Not from the piano, from the expectation that anyone would protect what mattered to me unless I explicitly did. There's a moment in every family where roles stop being accidental and start becoming permanent. You don't notice it happening. You just wake up one day and realize you've been cast. Daniel was the visionary. My father was the authority. My mother was the mediator. And I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed the impact. If Daniel overspent, I understood. If my father made a quick decision, I rationalized it. If my mother felt caught in between, I comforted her. No one sat me down and said, "This is your job." But over time, it became clear that my value was tied to how well I could smooth the edges of other people's volatility. I saw it most clearly the afternoon my mother called me, not to ask how I was, but to ask how Daniel was doing. "You talk to him more, right?" she said gently. "I don't," I replied. "Oh," a pause. "I just thought, you're the calm one. Maybe he listens to you." I almost laughed. Daniel didn't listen to me. He performed around me. "With my father," he debated. "With investors," he persuaded. With me, he explained, like I was the quiet audience that would nod at the right moments. Because I always had. That same week, my father sent a message in the family group chat, thinking of making some small adjustments around the house, clearing unused things. Unused things. It wasn't specific. It didn't need to be. My mother responded with a thumbs up emoji. Daniel sent a quick, "Good idea." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I typed, "Let me know if there's anything I should move." That was my pattern, preemptively cooperative. My father replied almost immediately, "Nothing urgent." Nothing urgent? Not nothing, just not urgent. At work, I handled compliance audits that involved millions of dollars. I could spot financial inconsistencies in 3 pages of documentation. I understood risk exposure before others even noticed it. But at home, I allowed ambiguity to stand unchallenged, because confrontation felt disproportionate. It was just a piano. It was just space. It was just timing. The truth is, I had been trained, gently, subtly, to equate my silence with maturity. If I didn't object, I was reasonable. If I didn't demand, I was gracious. If I didn't insist, I was low drama. And those qualities were praised. Daniel's boldness was exciting. My steadiness was convenient. That's the word I finally allowed myself to use. Convenient. I fit neatly into whatever shape the family needed. I didn't require recalibration. And convenience, I realized, has a hidden cost. Because when something is convenient, it's assumed to adapt. If the piano needed to be sold, the convenient daughter would understand. If the money needed to move, the convenient daughter wouldn't object. If the conversation needed to be avoided, the convenient daughter wouldn't force it. I wasn't invisible. I was predictable. And predictability is often mistaken for consent. That week, I found myself thinking less about music and more about structure, about ownership, about documentation. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because I had finally seen the shape of my assigned role. Reliable, useful, adjustable. And for the first time in my life, I wondered what would happen if I stopped adjusting. Not loudly, just quietly. The day the piano disappeared, no one called me. I found out because I stopped by unannounced. It was a Saturday in early spring. I had a conference in town and decided, almost impulsively, to visit the house afterward. I didn't text ahead. I didn't think I needed to. The front door is still stuck slightly near the bottom hinge. The hallway still smelled faintly of my mother's jasmine diffuser. But when I stepped into the living room, something felt wrong. You know how a room can look intact and still feel hollow? The wall where the piano had stood was bare. Not empty in a dramatic way, just clean. The rug had been vacuumed, the faint pedal indentations softened. The painting above had been lowered slightly, centered now over open space. There was no outline, no dust shadow, no visible trace that anything had ever been there. For a few seconds, my brain tried to correct it, as if the piano might reappear if I blinked properly. I walked closer. The floorboards where the wheels once pressed were smoother than the surrounding wood. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the grain. It was gone. My mother came out of the kitchen, drying her hands. She smiled when she saw me. "Oh, you're here!" Her expression shifted almost immediately. Not guilt, anticipation. "You didn't tell us you were coming!" "I was nearby," I said evenly. There was a pause. Then she glanced at the wall. "Your father meant to call you." "Meant to." I nodded slowly. "Where is it?" "Sold," she said quietly, and last week. I felt something tighten in my chest, but it wasn't explosive. It was precise. "How much?" She hesitated. "Enough to help." "Help!" I stood up. My voice didn't rise. He said I didn't need it anymore. It wasn't a question. My mother's eyes softened. "You don't play like you used to. And Daniel..." I held up my hand gently. Not to stop her, just to steady the moment. "How much?" I repeated. She gave me the number. It was lower than I expected, far lower. Not because the piano was rare, but because value isn't just a condition, it's context. And context had been ignored. I walked to the hallway closet where we kept old board games, opened it. Empty space where the metronome used to sit. "That too?" I asked. "Oh," she said. "We thought it went with the piano." "Of course. Accessories travel with assets." My father entered then, keys in hand, surprised to see me. "You're here," he said. "I am." He followed my gaze to the wall. "It was just sitting there," he said. Calm, practical. "You have your own life. You didn't need it anymore." Every word landed exactly as I had predicted months ago. Not cruel, not loud. Logical. I remembered the faint metallic buzz in middle A. The water ring is on the top. The bench cushion leaned slightly to the left. I remembered 8-year-old me watching it being carried in. I remembered practicing softly so no one would be disturbed. And I realized something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about the piano. It was about an assumption, about a decision made without me, because my silence had always been interpreted as flexibility. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply nodded once. Okay, I said. And that was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. Until then, I had been the stabilizer. From that day forward, I became the observer. And observers, when they decide to act, do so with full awareness of structure. I left shortly after. No scene, no slammed doors. In my car, I sat for a long time with the engine off. Then I took out my phone, and I began to take notes. The week after the piano was sold, no one brought it up again. That was the first confirmation. If they had felt they'd done something wrong, there would have been overcompensation. Explanations. Justifications are layered carefully over discomfort. Instead, there was normalcy. My father sent me an article about retirement planning. My mother asked if I was eating enough vegetables. Daniel posted a celebratory message about weathering the storm. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was a conclusion. In their minds, the matter had been resolved. An underused object converted into useful capital. A rational exchange. Efficient. I didn't correct them. At work, I was reviewing a series of compliance filings for a client restructuring personal guarantees tied to a family business. The documents were meticulous. Ownership percentages, repayment obligations, asset transfers, and clauses that only mattered if something went wrong. Most people skim those sections. I never do. For the first time, I saw the parallel clearly. My family functioned on implied contracts, unspoken expectations, assumed permissions, roles reinforced through repetition. And I had signed mine invisibly years ago by never objecting. That week, I stopped responding instantly to group messages. Not dramatically, just later. Where I once filled silence with reassurance, I allowed pauses to remain. Daniel called on Thursday night. You've been quiet, he said lightly. Busy, I replied. He launched into updates about new investors, promising leads. This time it's solid, he said. I listened. Glad to hear it, I answered. He waited, as if expecting something else. Advice, validation. When none came, he shifted topics. You weren't mad about the piano, right? He asked casually. There it was. I wasn't consulted, she said evenly with Sa. It was just sitting there, he replied quickly. And you don't even have space for it. That's true, I said. A pause stretched between us. Dad said you understood. I let that sit. I understand how the decision was made, I replied. That sentence unsettled him more than anger would have. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has weight. Before, my quietness had been interpreted. They filled it with whatever narrative suited them. Agreement, acceptance, indifference. Now my quietness was structural. I was no longer cushioning conversations, no longer smoothing implications. At home, I pulled out a small cardboard box from the back of my closet. Inside were childhood sheet music books, slightly warped at the edges, my old competition certificates, and one photograph of me at 9, seated at the piano, feet barely reaching the pedals. I placed the photo on my desk, not as nostalgia, as a reminder that something taken without discussion changes the architecture of trust. I didn't confront my father again. I didn't demand repayment. I didn't dramatize the loss. Instead, I began observing patterns more carefully. Who owned what? Whose name was on which documents? How money moved between accounts? Not obsessively, methodically. They mistook my silence for healing. In reality, it was calibration. There's a difference between reacting and repositioning. I wasn't planning revenge. That would require emotion. I was assessing exposure. And for the first time in my life, I stopped assuming that being easy was a virtue. Sometimes it's simply unclaimed territory. When people are used to you being predictable, they stop monitoring your movements. That was the first advantage. For years, I had been transparent to my family in a way that felt almost invisible. They knew my job title, but not the details. They knew I was good with money, but not how deeply I understood financial architecture. They knew I saved. They did not know how I structured. So when I began preparing, nothing about it looked unusual. Preparation didn't start with a confrontation. It started with documentation. I requested a copy of the bill of sale for the piano, not emotionally, professionally. I framed it as needing it for insurance records. My father forwarded it without hesitation. The sale price was confirmed. The buyer's name is listed, a local reseller. Below that, a short note, accessories included. I stared at that phrase longer than I expected. Accessories included. That metronome had cost less than a dinner for two. But it had kept my tempo steady for 15 years. It was never about market value. It was about who decides. I filed the document into a private folder on my laptop titled Family Transactions. No one knew it existed. Over the next few months, Daniel's updates became more optimistic. My father began mentioning short-term adjustments he had made to help stabilize things. Adjustments. That word again. I began asking small, precise questions. Is the house still under both your names? I asked my mother during a Sunday call. Yes, she said. Why? Just curious. I wasn't. I knew Daniel had previously used personal guarantees to secure business loans. I knew my father had a tendency to co-sign without fully calculating worst-case scenarios. I knew how quickly familial support can convert into legal exposure. At work, I dealt with worst-case scenarios daily. At home, no one did. So I started building a parallel awareness. I pulled public records, reviewed property filings, checked lien histories, all are legally accessible, all ordinary actions for someone in my profession. What they never noticed was this. I wasn't reacting to the piano. I was recalibrating my position within the family's financial ecosystem. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If everything collapsed tomorrow, where would I stand? The answer wasn't as secure as I once assumed. Daniel had influence, my father had authority, my mother had emotional leverage. I had distance. Distance can be a weakness, or it can be clarity. One evening, Daniel called again. This time his tone was thinner. There's a small delay, he said. Investor paperwork. How exposed is Dad? He paused. What do you mean? Is he a guarantor? Silence. He's just helping, Daniel said carefully. That wasn't my question. He deflected, changed the subject, promised it was contained. That word lingered long after we hung up. Contained. I opened a spreadsheet that night. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just columns, assets, liabilities, names attached, risk probability. I didn't share it with anyone. I didn't threaten to use it. But knowledge changes posture, and posture changes outcomes. The girl who once practiced scales softly so she wouldn't disturb anyone was gone. In her place was someone who understood that silence, when paired with information, is not submission. It's leverage waiting for alignment, and alignment I knew was coming. The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in fragments. A missed call from my mother on a Tuesday afternoon. A bank notification was forwarded to my father's email by mistake. A casual sentence from Daniel that didn't align with public records. Individually, none of it meant much. Together they formed a pattern. The accidental email was the turning point. My father had meant to forward a statement to Daniel. Instead, it landed in my inbox. We share similar initials. It happens. The subject line was simple, refinance confirmation. I didn't open it immediately. I stared at it first, because I already knew what it might contain. When I did open it, the numbers were clean, structured, legal. Home equity line of credit, recently approved. Primary residence listed as collateral. Amount, significantly higher than the piano's sale value. I sat very still. The piano hadn't been the solution. It had been the beginning. The house I grew up in, the house with the hallway hinge that stuck, the house where I learned to minimize myself, had been leveraged. Not sold, not yet, but risked. And my father had signed. I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. All those months of language, bridge, temporary, adjustment, had been soft framing for something much larger. I checked the county records again. The lien was already filed. Legally valid, properly executed. Daniel hadn't just needed help. He had needed coverage. And my father had provided it, without consulting me. Not because I had ownership over the house, but because I had always been positioned as outside the financial core. Daniel was the investment. I was the observer. Until now. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. No music swelled. No confrontation exploded. It was a quiet shift in understanding. If the house defaulted, everything would change. And if everything changed, they would expect me to stabilize it. Because that was my role. The reliable one. The financially literate one. The one who could figure something out. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had never allowed. What if I didn't? What if I refused to be the silent contingency plan? I closed my laptop and walked to the window of my apartment. Seattle rain blurred the streetlights below. My reflection stared back at me, composed, analytical, steady. I wasn't powerless. I was simply unannounced. There's a difference. I began mapping scenarios that night. If Daniel's venture recovered, the line of credit would quietly close. No one would mention the risk. The piano would remain a footnote. If it failed, the house would carry debt my parents could not comfortably absorb. In that scenario, there would be urgency. And urgency invites intervention. But intervention can take many forms. You can step in emotionally. You can step in financially. Or you can step in structurally. I chose the third. I contacted a real estate attorney the following week. Not to challenge anything, not to accuse, to understand, to prepare. Quiet dominance isn't about raising your voice. It's about ensuring that when the moment arrives, you are the only one in the room who already knew it was coming. And now I did. By the time summer arrived, I had 3 clear paths in front of me. I laid them out the way I do at work. Cleanly, cleanly without emotion. Option 1, say nothing. Let Daniel's risk resolve itself. If it failed, step in financially to help my parents stabilize the house, preserve harmony, absorb the impact quietly. This was the version of me they expect. Option 2, confront my father directly, demand transparency, insist on being included in financial decisions, push for boundaries. This would create tension. It might even create change, but it would still center me as reactive. Option 3, restructure my position entirely, not emotionally, legally. No announcements, no accusations, just alignment. The third option felt irreversible, because once you shift from assumed daughter to independent stakeholder, the dynamic never returns to its original shape. I scheduled a consultation with the real estate attorney I'd spoken to briefly before. This time, I came prepared, with numbers, lien filings, and loan term. I don't own the property, I said, but I need to understand exposure. He reviewed the documents calmly. The house is leveraged, he confirmed. If payments aren't maintained, foreclosure is a possibility, but it's not immediate. What protections exist for other family members? I asked. He looked at me carefully. Are you planning to contribute? That depends, I replied. He explained something simple but powerful. If I injected money without a formal agreement, it would be considered a gift. If I wanted security, it required documentation, lien positioning, ownership percentage, or recorded loan terms. Structure. That word again. I left the office with clarity. If Daniel's venture failed and my parents needed support, I would not step in as the convenient daughter. I would step in as a secured creditor. The thought didn't feel cold. It felt fair. For years, I had equated love with flexibility. But flexibility without boundaries erodes respect. That night, my mother called. Daniel's under some pressure, she said softly, but it will pass. How exposed is the house? I asked. A pause. It's fine, she replied too quickly. Mum! Another pause, longer this time. Your father believes in him. I closed my eyes briefly. I know! I said. That was the truth. My father didn't sell my piano because he didn't value me. He sold it because he believed in Daniel's potential more urgently than he believed in my attachment. Belief is powerful, but it is not collateral. The decision point came quietly one Thursday evening when Daniel texted, "If things get tight, would you be able to float something short-term?" There it was, the contingency plan. No apology for the piano. No acknowledgement of the risk already taken. Just an assumption. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened the draft agreement template the attorney had prepared for me. Simple, clean, professional. If I provided funds, it would be documented, secured against the property, with repayment terms. Not punitive, protective. I finally replied, if support is needed, it will be formal, through documentation. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Why so serious? Because you sold something of mine without asking. Because the house is leveraged. Because silence is no longer consent. But I didn't type any of that. I wrote, clarity prevents misunderstandings. He didn't respond for a long time. And in that silence, I understood something important. They had never imagined I would choose structure over sentiment. That was the irreversible shift. Not anger, alignment. From that point forward, whatever happened would unfold within clear lines, and I was no longer standing outside them. After that message, no one called for 3 days. That alone told me everything. When families are built on informal understanding, formality feels like distance, like accusation, like distrust. But I hadn't accused anyone. I had simply drawn a line where none had existed before. On Monday morning, I wired a small amount into a separate account I had opened the week prior, reserved exclusively for potential family intervention. Not a gift fund, not emergency savings. A structured response fund. I labelled it plainly, contingent loan reserve. At work, I requested additional training on asset-backed lending frameworks. It aligned with a new compliance initiative, so no one questioned it. I studied lean priority rules more closely, reviewed foreclosure timelines in Washington state. Not because I wanted to collapse, because I refused to enter rooms unprepared. Daniel eventually called. "You're making this weird," he said lightly, but I could hear strain underneath. "I'm making it clear," I replied. "It's family." "Yes, that means trust. It means clarity," I corrected gently. He exhaled sharply. "So you'd charge interest? If funds are provided, they will follow standard terms." "You've changed." That word lingered. Maybe I had. Or maybe I had stopped adapting. My father called later that evening. His tone was different. Measured. "Your brother says you're asking for paperwork. I'm offering structured support." I said, "Silence. It sounds transactional," he replied. "So we're selling the piano?" I answered calmly. There it was, the first time I named it. He didn't deny it. "It was necessary." "Sorry," he said. "I understand," I replied. "And if this becomes necessary, I will also handle it accordingly." He didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. But something in his breathing shifted, a recalculation. For weeks after that, I did a nothing visible. No family meetings, no ultimatums. I simply maintained posture. When Daniel sent updates, I responded neutrally. When my mother expressed worry, I listened but did not reassure her. When my father referenced temporary strain, I asked about repayment schedules. Questions, not accusations. That's the difference between noise and pressure. Eventually, Daniel sent a document draft, clearly pulled from an online template. "Is this enough?" he asked. It wasn't. The language was vague, no collateral clause, no repayment enforcement. I revised it in 30 minutes and returned a clean version with precise terms. Collateral, secondary position against the property, repayment schedule, fixed installments, default terms, defined. I didn't add penalties, I added structure. He stared at it for 2 days before responding. "This is intense." "So is leverage," I said. The house remained standing. The line of credit remained active. Payments were being made, for now. But something had changed in the family dynamic. They no longer saw me as the automatic cushion. They saw me as a variable. And variables must be accounted for. The quiet dominance wasn't loud. It didn't humiliate anyone. It simply ensured that if I stepped into the equation, I would not disappear inside it. I didn't know yet whether Daniel's venture would recover or collapse. But I knew this. If the house was going to carry risk, so would every decision moving forward. Including mine. The shift didn't explode. It surfaced gradually, like pressure redistributing across a structure that had long relied on one silent beam. Daniel stopped sending casual updates. When he did message, the tone had changed. Fewer grand promises, more careful wording. My mother began asking questions she'd never asked before. How exactly does interest work? What happens if payments are late? Would paperwork hurt Daniel's credit? Questions that should have been asked months earlier. Now they were. My father grew quieter. Not angry, not confrontational, measured. I could feel him recalibrating the same way I had months ago. Reassessing risk. Reassessing me. One evening, he called unexpectedly. "I reviewed your draft," he said. "And? It's thorough." "That's the point." Another pause. "You've always been thorough," he added, almost to himself. It wasn't praise, it was recognition. Daniel's venture began showing strain publicly. A partnership dissolved, a delayed payment triggered a minor default clause. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to tighten cash flow. I didn't intervene, not yet. The house payments were still current, but the emotional landscape at home shifted. My mother sounded tired when we spoke. "I don't like tension," she admitted quietly. "There doesn't have to be tension," I replied. "There just has to be clarity. You used to just say, yeah," she said. "I let that sit between us." "Yes," I agreed softly. That was the consequence no one anticipated. They hadn't lost money yet. They had lost predictability. For years, my presence had been stabilizing because it required nothing. I absorbed stress without altering direction. Now every financial move requires consideration. Would Doris formalize this? Would Doris ask for documentation? Would Doris remain outside the equation? Awareness changes behavior. Daniel called late one night again. I didn't think you'd make it this formal, he admitted. You didn't think I'd protect myself, I corrected gently. It's not about you. That sentence revealed everything. It is, I said calmly. Silence. He wasn't used to that answer. In his worldview, family operated on fluid loyalty. Support moved instinctively toward urgency, but urgency without accountability becomes habit. And habits left unchecked compound. The real consequence wasn't financial. It was structural. My father began discussing decisions with me before making them. Small ones at first, home repairs, refinancing considerations. Not because he needed my permission, but because he had realized there's something subtle. I was no longer outside the financial architecture. I was part of it, not as a convenience, as a participant. And participation requires consent. The piano had been sold quietly. The house had been leveraged quietly. But now nothing could move without awareness. They hadn't lost the house. They hadn't defaulted. But they had lost the assumption that I would always adjust. And that loss unsettled them more than any interest rate ever could. The actual strain surfaced in late autumn. Daniel's venture didn't collapse dramatically. It thinned. Revenue projections missed twice. A key partner withdrew permanently. A short-term extension turned into another bridge. Bridges, I had learned, rarely lead where promised. My father called me one Sunday afternoon. Not tense, not panicked, just quieter than usual. We may need to activate your proposal, he said. He didn't say help. He didn't say loan. He said the proposal. Language matters. How far behind, I asked. 2 months, he replied. I closed my eyes briefly, not from shock, but from confirmation. The timeline aligned almost exactly with the risk model I'd built months earlier. Is the line maxed? Yes, there it was. The house was no longer just leveraged. It was strained. My mother cried later that evening. Not loudly, just the exhausted kind of crying that happens when belief meets reality. We didn't think it would stretch this far, she said. I didn't remind her about the piano. I didn't say I warned you. I didn't need to. They already knew something unspoken. If I stepped in now, it would not be as the easy daughter. It would be under terms. Daniel asked to meet in person. We sat at the same dining table where, years ago, I had quietly closed the piano lid after my father's comment. He looked smaller somehow. Not diminished, just recalculated. I can recover this, he said. I just need time. Time requires structure, I replied evenly. You're really going to collateralize the house? He asked. I'm going to protect my contribution, I said. My father sat across from us, hands folded. Not defensive, not proud. Reflective. We didn't include you before, he admitted slowly. That was the closest I would ever come to an apology. You didn't, I agreed. Silence filled the room, not hostile, just heavy with recognition. My mother whispered, we can't undo that. No, I said calmly, but you can't. And that was the moment it became too late to fix. Not the finances, but the old dynamic. Even if the loan was repaid tomorrow, even if Daniel rebuilt everything, even if the house stood untouched for decades, the assumption had been broken. I transferred the funds 3 days later under the signed agreement. Recorded, secured, filed. No dramatic ceremony, just signatures. Daniel looked at me differently after that. Not resentful, not grateful, aware. My father began consulting me before making any further financial moves, not out of obligation, but because he now understood that I would no longer absorb impact silently. The house stabilized. Payments resumed. Crisis avoided. But something irreversible had already occurred. I was no longer the quiet background support. I was defined in line in the contract. And once someone sees you as structural rather than optional, they cannot unsee it. The piano could not be returned. The metronome would never sit on that shelf again. But neither would I sit in that house as unclaimed space. Some things can be repaired. Assumptions cannot. The formal conversation happened months later. Not during a crisis. Not during urgency. After stability returned. The loan payments were current. Daniel's business had stabilized enough to breathe. The house was no longer at immediate risk. That's when my father asked me to come over for dinner. No tension in his voice, just intention. We sat in the living room afterward. The same wall still bare where the piano had once stood. A bookshelf now filled the space. Practical, clean. He looked at it briefly before speaking. I miscalculated, he said. Not defensively, not dramatically. Just plain. I didn't interrupt. I thought selling the piano would be small, he continued. Temporary. I didn't think it would represent anything. It represented assumption, I said quietly. He nodded once. I believed you wouldn't mind. I didn't have the chance to, I replied. Silence settled between us, not hostile, not strained, measured. My mother sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. We treated Daniel like an investment, she said softly. And you like stability. That sentence held more honesty than any apology could. Yes, I said. My father leaned forward slightly. You changed, he said, not accusing, observing. I stopped adjusting, I answered. Another pause. Do you resent us? My mother asked carefully. I considered the question fully before responding. No, I said, I understand you. And I meant it. They weren't villains. They weren't malicious. They were operating from belief. Belief in potential. Belief in recovery. Belief that I would always be fine. Being perceived as fine can erase you. But it doesn't have to harden you. I don't regret formalizing the loan, I continued. It protects everyone. My father gave a small nod. It protects you, he said. Yes, there was no argument in that acknowledgement. For the first time, the three of us were sitting with the same understanding. Not a parent and a compliant daughter. Not a risk-taker and stabilizer. Just adults are aware of consequence. The confrontation never escalated. No raised voices, no emotional eruptions. Because this was never about volume. It was about recognition. Before I left that night, my father said something I hadn't expected. If you ever want another piano, he began, hesitating slightly, we can look together. I didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about replacing wood and strings. It was about choice. I'll let you know, I said gently. And that was enough. We didn't need to revisit the sale price. We didn't need to dissect Daniel's mistakes again. The dynamic had already shifted. They now knew I would not disappear quietly into flexibility. And I knew I could hold boundaries without hostility. The wall where the piano once stood remained different. But so did I. I bought another piano a year later. Not out of nostalgia, not as a statement. Out of intention. This one sits in my own apartment. Smaller, modern, paid in full. Delivered on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was home to receive it. I chose it myself. The first time I pressed the keys, I didn't think about the old house. I didn't replay the sale. I didn't measure it against what was lost. I simply played. The sound filled a space that belonged entirely to me. That's the difference. Not ownership of an object. Ownership of position. The loan to my family continues to be repaid on schedule. The house is stable. Daniel's business operates more conservatively now. He consults professionals before making major moves. Sometimes he even asks my opinion. Not because I demand it. Because he understands I will answer clearly. My father includes me in financial discussions by default now. He sends documents before signing. He asks, do you see any exposure here? That question used to belong only to Daniel. My mother calls me for advice, not just reassurance. The dynamic didn't fracture. It matured. I am no longer the easy daughter. I am not the difficult one either. I am the defined one. There's a calmness that comes from knowing you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. I don't revisit the piano in conversation. I don't remind them what it cost me emotionally, because I no longer need acknowledgement to validate what I felt. Quiet dominance isn't coldness. It's clarity without hostility. It's the ability to say, I understand you, but I also understand myself. The girl who practiced softly so she wouldn't disturb anyone has grown into a woman who plays at full volume in her own home. Not to be heard, but because she can. And if I ever return to that living room wall again, I won't see absence. I'll see the moment I stop being adjustable. That's who I am now. Not resentful, not reactive. Resolved. If you've listened this far, you probably understand something important. This was never about a piano. It was about how easily people mistake quiet for agreement. How often does the dependable one become the default solution? How quickly, you don't mind, right, replaces, what do you think? My father didn't wake up intending to hurt me. My brother didn't plan to erase something meaningful. They acted inside a pattern that had worked for years, and I allowed that pattern to exist by being flexible without limits. The turning point wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't withdrawal. It was structured. The moment I decided that if I participated, I would participate clearly. No raised voice, no dramatic exit, just defined boundaries. Some people think boundaries create distance. In my case, they created respect. The house still stands. The loan is being repaid. My family still gathers for dinner. But the dynamic is different now. Not because I demanded an apology, because I required acknowledgement. And sometimes, the most powerful shift you can make isn't changing other people. It's changing what they can assume about you. So if you're the easy one in your family, the stable one, the one who understands, I want to leave you with this. Understanding does not require self-erasure. Love does not require silent sacrifice. And calm does not mean powerless. You don't have to shout to be taken seriously. Sometimes you just have to stop adjusting. Let me ask you, have you ever realized that being the reliable one came at a cost? And if you stopped absorbing everything quietly, what do you think would change?